Good morning. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with Professor James Pennebaker today, who is our invited speaker for the Apple Lecture Series hosted by the TESOL Applied Linguistics Program. We'll be talking with Professor Pennebaker today about his work and also advice that he has for the current or future researchers in our field. So thank you very much, Professor, for making the time to interview today. And before we start, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker. So Professor James Pennebaker is the Regents Professor of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the Executive Director of a university-wide educational initiative called the Project 2021. His earlier work on expressive writing found that physical health can actually improve by writing about traumatic events, and more recent studies have explored natural language, and he finds that everyday word use is related to personality, emotional state, status, group dynamics, and so on. His current position with Project 2021 involves rethinking educational practices for undergraduates and at the University of Texas. And he's also the author or editor of 10 books and more than 300 articles, amazing. And he's received numerous awards and international university awards for his research and also his teaching. So thank you once again for coming. And I would like to open with a question about your journey as to how you have come to this position, and because your research includes so many different facets from different fields, medicine, psychology, education, sociology, linguistics. So we are interested in knowing what brought you to these fields and what underlies all of these, what the common thread is under all of these diverse interests.
I think that the common thread is I have a short attention span. That I follow questions that interest me. And as you'll hear in the talks I'm giving today, I often will start off on a question that really intrigues me, and then I find something that makes no sense, and then I'll start following that thread for a while. And then that'll lead me to yet another area. So I started off being interested in kind of mind-body questions, and which by definition was related to kind of a cross between physiology and medicine, health, but also psychology, which then led me into the world of clinical psychology, which is not my area. I'm a social psychologist by training. And then from there, stumbling across some problems in terms of how to interpret what people were saying, which led me into the world of computer science, which then led me down this other path of language and linguistics, which then led me into the world of education. And to me, one should never take your discipline too seriously. The question's what's interesting and what's important. And I can say this as though it's an easy thing to do, but it's a high-risk thing to do early in your career, because the people around you want them to do what they do. And if you don't, it makes things harder. And early in my career, I had to deal with some, what's the right word, blowback, because I didn't fit in very well. But once you get tenure, then they're stuck with you. And the work you do, doing work that's cross-disciplinary, I think is the most important work you can do. That's where science is. And then you are rewarded really handsomely because of it.
So how would you define yourself? Would you call yourself
I've gone back and forth about this for years. I call myself now a social psychologist. I was trained as a social psychologist, but traditional social psychology, I don't do traditional social psychology. But my view now is that I think the field should come around to what I do, because I'm not going to where they are. But I'm interested in that broad issue of how are people connected. And that, you all are in education, that's social psychology,
Mhm.
and learning and thinking,
Mhm.
but that's all social psychology.
Right.
Health,
Mhm.
that's social psychology.
So we'll be doing this interview based on different themes, sort of. So we'll start by asking you questions that are more directly related to your articles and your research, and then we'll move on to talk about questions that are more specifically related to second language learners. And then finally, we'll talk about applications such as in politics and other future research
Sure.
ideas. So we'll start by you, Lynn. You
Hi. Dr. Pennebaker, your article about expressive writing, it reminds me of the movie The Great Gatsby, like how he wrote to heal. And it also reminded me of a quote that I found very interesting. Like, we write to find out what we don't know we know. So I wonder how much you agree with that quote.
I completely agree with that. And, you know, it's always interesting, you know, I look back at my own career when I started doing research and writing. And very often I would do a study and I'd have a good idea what I was looking for, and often I find it, sometimes I didn't. But then I then start writing the paper up, and I start with the introduction. And I would start writing and I would realize that this study that I'd done wasn't really what I thought. That in many ways, doing an experiment and writing it up, you start to realize things that you just didn't know. And that led me later on to expressive writing. And I think that idea is true, that we start off on any given topic, whether it's a personal issues you're dealing with or intellectual issues, and you have a good sense of what they are. And then you start writing, and writing really forces a structure that your mind doesn't have. And it allows you to start putting things together in ways that you hadn't appreciated. So it's one level, the quote is right, and another one is not right. It's right in the sense that the seeds of good ideas are all there that you've seen, but it's not right in the sense that you knew it all along. Rather, I think it's more a discovery process.
Thank you. Another question is on the research, the program, the LIWC.
LIWC.
Yeah,
Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count.
Word count, yes. And I was curious how they, during the text analysis and the writing styles that it's analyzing, what are the weaknesses and the strengths that
Of the LIP program
of
itself?
the program, yeah.
This is a very long, I could go on for several hours. Very briefly, the LIP program was a system I developed trying to answer a specific question many years ago, and I thought it would be a real simple project to do, and it wasn't. But the idea behind it is that we use words, words are not randomly selected, and that by analyzing words, you could do a pretty good crude analysis just by counting them. So for example, if this entire videotape is transcribed and you analyzed it and you put it into a word cloud, people would know immediately that this was not an interview on automobiles. They'd know it was not on weather, and it doesn't deal with it doesn't deal with personal relationships. You would pick up pretty quickly that it was probably related to language, writing, things like that, because the words we use are much more dense. But as I'll talk later on, the way that I'm speaking, the way that we're speaking, will say a lot about who I am and what our relationships are. And again, it's all just counting words. Now, linguists would say, this is the stupidest approach to language. I mean, when I first started this, linguists were just dismissive of what I was doing because I'm ignoring context. Yeah, who cares? I'm ignoring syntax. Not my problem. I'm breaking all the rules of linguistics, and I'm sure you and your advisors are probably going to go, oh God, please don't say that. Oh no, because what I'm doing is really crude, and it is crude, but it's a good first step, because what I'm doing is so stupidly simple. You know, many of you are studying language, and you might spend an hour, a day, a week, a career on one text. Well, for me, that's a nanosecond. And if you spend a day on that same text, and I can analyze it in a second, I'm going to guess that you're going to get a much more subtle, detailed, thoughtful sense of that. But I'm going to get a pretty good sense by spending virtually no time having my computer program just go through and saying, okay, 5% of the words are articles and prepositions, and 3% are pronouns. And immediately I know something about that text.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is fast and efficient, but it doesn't have nuance.
Okay, moving on to the next question. So my questions are related to your recent article titled "When Small Words Will Tell Academic Success: The Case of College Admission Essays." So in the paper, you found the relationships between higher grades at college and greater article and preposition use in college admission essays. So you analyzed students' use of function words, but given that articles and prepositions are normally followed by nouns, so do you think that their use of articles played an important role in the result reported in the study?
That's a fabulous question. So the basic finding was that there's this central feature of language, which is, and because I focus on function words, on one end are high use of articles and preposition, and the others are pronouns and auxiliary verbs and some other words. And it is a continuum, and we can identify people anywhere along that. And in a funny kind of way, it's almost nouns versus verbs. That nouns, more any given text uses nouns unless it uses verbs, and vice versa. So in a sense, you're right that the more that people use nouns, the better they do in college. But it turns out nouns don't predict college success nearly as well as articles and prepositions, because it's the way that people are referring to these nouns. Because if the person is talking about my car versus a car or the car, my car is much more personal as opposed to a or the car. Or two cars is also more kind of psychologically detached than is our cars. By focusing on the articles or prepositions, the author is standing back and looking at the world in a colder, more detached way. So the number of nouns actually could be very similar, but the degree to which the person is standing back looking at something in a detached way, I think, is a marker of how the person thinks. So I fell into the same way of thinking that you are initially, that this was all just nouns. And I've gone back, and in fact, just this last week, I browbeat my students. Browbeat's not exactly right, but I was thinking, well, why don't we add nouns to our algorithms? And one of my students, Ryan Boyd, who's brilliant at this, who's done this, who has tested this himself, he pointed out it just isn't as strong as focusing on articles and prepositions.
So articles and prepositions are two grammatical features that are notoriously difficult for English language learners. So do you think that the analysis of English language learners' article and preposition use would generate similar findings?
Ooh, another wonderful question. The answer is, I happen to know that the answer is yes, among students who come to the University of Texas. Now, to get into the University of Texas, you have to be, at the top of your high school class. You have to know how to use articles and prepositions. But one of the things, so articles and prepositions are part of this broader group of words of function words. And function words to me are interesting because they're the hardest words to learn. So it's not just articles and prepositions. As you all know, second language learners really screw up in the second language for all of those dimensions. And we've done some analyses. Another group that I've collaborated with has used the analysis of function words to identify the person's primary language, because every language screws up in some way. And I speak bad Spanish, but I've been always interested in terms of how, if I'm trying to get from here to there to explain something, I go along and then I can't remember which function word to use, so I'll just take a side trip and describe it in some other way to get here. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, I'm not using some obscure feature of Spanish that I just have never really mastered. And I think everybody makes that same kind of jump when they are really struggling with the second language that they learn as an adult.
Then what implications would the study have for writing teaching practice?
So here's the killer problem. We know that function words are processed in the brain differently than content words. Content words, we have a really good sense of how they work and how they work in terms of learning. And you all know this better than I do. By God, you can just force the student to learn this noun, this regular verb, this adverb, and so forth, and they get so they can use it. And you train them over and over and over again with these function words, and they are really resistant to change. And this is not my area. I don't know what the best way is. I would assume not just repetition, but practice over and over and over again, because you really the learning is profoundly different than learning a concept. So we all understand what a cup is, and that's universal. We can train cup pretty quickly, but to distinguish between a cup and B cup, or this cup and that cup, wow, that is so complicated.
So my question is related to your article about finding the psychological signature of an author through the text analysis. So the idea of being able to create someone's psychological signature is really fascinating. And given that the article focused on writing and text analysis of written work, would it be possible also to do the same analysis with spontaneous oral speech? And given that the two, writing versus speech, are very different, what would you think would be the differences, and what would be a truer measure of someone's psychological state?
So, the way people speak and talk is similar. We're dealing here with the same human. We also have to take into account context, because very often when the person is writing, they're writing in more formal context. But sometimes they they tweet, they send a text message, they write a love letter. All of those are a different context than a term paper. So the rule is the more informal the context, which speaking usually is, the more that people will actually use fewer nouns, more verbs. They will use fewer articles and prepositions, more pronouns and auxiliary verbs and others. So there's this general shift as a function of context. it's not written versus spoken, because in a formal spoken context, you're going to speak like formal writing. So I don't view it as spoken versus written, because when we've compared those, by and large, they're consistent. So this signature issue, in terms of identifying a person by their signature, I think it's not perfect by any means, but it does pretty well. And what I love about spoken language is it comes out so quickly and so unguarded that it's a great marker of personality.
Thank you. So the next question is regarding second language learners. So do you think the psychological signature that someone has in their first language would be transferred in part or en masse into their second language? Or will the learners somehow construct a new psychological signature in the process of creating a new identity or in their emerging second language?
That's a wonderful question. And we played with that in the past. So one of my former students, Myron Ramirez, has done some work on this where she was looking at Spanish and English bilinguals. And so they came in a week apart, and on 1 week they were in there for an hour and everything was in Spanish. From the person who, when they came in, it was all Spanish. And the next week was all English. And some people, the first week was English. And they filled out questionnaires about themselves. They were interviewed. And what was interesting was there are slight differences in terms of their personality, their self-reports when they're speaking Spanish versus English. And the way they express themselves is different in Spanish versus English. And you all are, I assume, all bilingual. And I'm guessing that you would say, yeah, I am a little bit different in one language versus another. Now, it's a little bit weird because the context is different. When you're speaking one language, you're around other people who speak that language, you share certain historical and cultural experiences. And then when you speak another language, it's a different context. But even then, I think there's some subtle differences. I do think our personalities are a little bit different in one versus the other. But I think in terms of this signature idea, assuming the person is fluent in both languages, I think the signature would overlap quite a bit. I don't know of any good research on that. It would be a great topic to explore. One of the interesting problems is, because the signature is all based on function words. As you know, say Chinese, for example, doesn't have articles. And so, as you also know, very often people whose native language is Chinese, when they learn English, they avoid sentences that have articles. And so they use this and that at much higher rates, so that they're able to bypass that problem. And the degree to which any mathematical approach relies on a particular word or set of words will be thrown off by that. But if we know that, we could substitute this and that for A or the, or for the specifically.
So interesting, because I not necessarily in English, but I bypass, I struggle with articles in Italian. I'm currently learning Italian. I struggle a great deal with articles because it's prepositional articles. It's not just articles by itself.
How interesting. How do you avoid the problem?
I just mess up constantly.
So there's not some way you can stick in a pronoun in place of the...
I think I tend to overdo it, knowing that I struggle with that. I overdo it when I don't need, perhaps if I have, what I meant to say something, I would say the something.
Yeah. No, it's funny because in Spanish, future tense, because English doesn't have future tense. And so you just use a helper verb. And so, I'll sit there and I'm trying to say something about the future, but oh, Jesus, I don't know. So everything is, to go. It always precedes all future things. And so stick with the infinitive.
I guess moving on to my questions, given our current political climate, everyone is just so sick of this. I wonder how, taken out of the, taking sides aspect of it, and our own political, perspective or agenda, I wonder how we could use your research and apply that to build, psychological signatures for important public figures, and then have the people or the press make use of that in some way.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, with one of my students, Kayla Jordan, we actually have done that and have a blog, and had this blog for a year and a half up to the election. And, it was picked up by some media, not much. And it basically said what everybody knows, is that our current president is not even remotely analytic. He's not thoughtful. He's incapable of an if-thens statement. He can't think hierarchically. But he has a lot of confidence. And I don't think it matters. That's people don't vote very logically. And this is true both Republicans and Democrats. So yes, we will continue to do articles analyzing people. How much good does it do? Beats me. And this, I'll probably mention this in one of my talks. From my perspective, this was the best election ever, because I've never seen such extreme linguistic styles. My favorite were Trump and Ted Cruz. That they are so different. And it was interesting as an academic, who was scarier. I personally think Ted Cruz was scarier. But I don't mean this in a negative way. But the point is you get really different insight into people. So Trump was not at all particularly smart, or in a logical kind of way. Cruz was incredibly smart in a logical way. By far the most analytic of all the candidates running. But here was Cruz, and then here was everybody else, and then here was Trump. In terms of another marker of certainty, so a person is absolutely certain of what they say is true. Cruz was way out here, and the second person who knew truth was Bernie Sanders, who was right next to him. And everybody else was in here, including Trump and Clinton and everybody else. I find people who know truth to be problematic, because they are incapable of compromising and working with others.
I just watched a debate between the two of them, CNN,
Oh, I didn't see that.
the healthcare.
And my guess is Bernie spoke with great certainty and knew all the answers.
I think because the reason I asked this question was because of this political environment, I'm personally kind of drawn to the press briefings, and as a lot of others are starting to as well. And I really wonder how the press can do better during these moments when you get a chance to talk to representatives of the administration. And I constantly feel this frustration that they're still kind of using their kind of established techniques to interview, and you're talking to people that are completely different now. And I wonder whether there's a way to use your research in a way to better ask better questions, or you know,
Be more strategic.
yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I haven't thought about it. It reminds me a little bit of what clinical psychologists have to deal with when they're trying to interview people. One of the big problems that's going on right now is both sides feel that the other side isn't listening. And I think that's true. Both sides do not listen at all. And, you know, I will say sometimes Trump and his group say things that are actually smart, but nobody on the left can hear it. It's just as though you can't hear it. And then I'll sometimes read an article in the Times or someplace where they point out, oh yeah, Obama said the same thing. And you go, ooh, oh okay, well I guess he's not. But the point is that, so in psychotherapy, one reason therapy is so effective is because the therapist is trained to learn how to listen. So if somebody says something that might be, that most of us would think, wow, that's crazy talk. What the therapist will do is often just repeat back. So it sounds like you're saying so-and-so. And then the person, it might be that that's not really what they're thinking, but they go down some other route. So I don't know, but I would urge the press to try to listen to the current administration. Just try to get a better sense of what they're trying to do. And I'm guessing this is really tough because the reality is Trump has a real short attention span. And we know that he changes positions frequently. One of our problems is we don't know what are his deepest values, because so much of the interaction is kind of this gotcha mentality.
What you're saying, I completely agree that it seems that both in this time of dividedness, both sides, if we can categorize in such a way, both sides seem to view the other side in an incredibly reductionist way. And I wonder, you know, since people even argue over facts and truth, whether you have, you know, what your thoughts are about, you know, dealing with this issue of even, you know, disagree to the point of not agreeing over facts.
You know, I think that this is a real tough one, because I think the argument claims to be facts, but it's deeper than that. So, you know, we go back to how many people were at the inauguration. A completely stupid bunch of arguments from the beginning. I think, you know, the first part was just dealing with the vanity of Trump, and just pointing out that what he said objectively wasn't true. And then I think the issue in terms of the raw number really started to kind of somewhat go out of control, because the issue was, why were we talking about it? Or why is the press dwelling on this? And it's a very interesting question, because on one level, all it was a marker of vanity. And it was fascinating for me, both why Trump couldn't let it go. But then it was kind of interesting why the press couldn't let it go. And it was probably because each side wouldn't let it go, and they just kept doing it. And here, and there have been several editorials in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere saying, why are we spending all our time on these dumb things when there's some really important issues that we need to be dealing with?
Do you have any other follow-up questions that you would like to ask? Maybe? Yeah. Okay, so we're already at our final question. So we would like to ask for your advice in general for students like us and future researchers who are interested in doing the similar line of research you are doing, or research in general. What kind of advice would you have? Because our main audience is students, so that would be great.
So you all are in an interesting period because the world is changing radically. From the time that you started undergraduate education to now, things are upside down. So for example, your libraries aren't the same as they were. Students, you came to college with cell phones, but they didn't dominate education. You came to college, I assume, with your laptops that you could take to classes, but you probably didn't, to now, depending on the teacher, it's a central part of the class. You came to college with the idea that an online class was a bad idea because online classes were terrible, to a period now when the whole nature of education is profoundly changing. My recommendation, first of all, is acknowledge and embrace these changes and become an expert in them, because they're going to be critical to your getting jobs, because the future of education will be a lot more online. And a second issue in my world, and it may be yours, is that much of this is heavily technological. So having awareness, being digitally smart, even having a rough knowledge of code is not a bad idea. Knowing, at the very worst, spending time with some computer scientists in terms of how to start thinking about data in ways that we haven't in the past. So, you're looking at, verbal, nonverbal issues, or you're looking at language acquisition. A lot of these questions can be answered with computers and computer programs in really creative, interesting ways. And what's interesting is computer scientists are really good with computers, but they're not good with understanding the purpose of language and human relationships. And you know that, but you're not that great with computer science. And what it requires is working together. So my first issue is being open to the revolution that is here. The second is standing back and thinking where the important discoveries are. And I've always felt the most important discoveries are in the area between disciplines. Now you all are an interesting group because you already cross education and linguistics and culture. But my recommendation is always pay attention to other disciplines that could help you. And my work in language and education both is this mixture of social science and computer science, which right now is very hot. And in 5 years that might not be true, but always seek to collaborate with people whose discipline is somewhat different from yours, because if you're looking for grants, you'll get them. Jobs, you'll get them. And that's another issue, is traditional academics is becoming increasingly difficult because basically the system is finding that, wow, it's a lot cheaper not to pay a full-time faculty member. We'll get piecemeal labor from people. I'm guessing you all have skills that most people don't, that you are highly conversant in 2 or more languages. And also you have knowledge of education and teaching. And I guess my recommendation is just to think broadly about possible jobs. So people who work in my lab, unlike most of the people in social psychology in my department, all my students get good jobs. They always do, so far. And they get academic jobs, and they get big jobs in the private sector. And they're all research jobs, because that's what they want to do. But the academic jobs, some are in psychology, some are information science, some in communication. And my attitude is, who cares? It's all good. And they can also get jobs in business schools and sometimes in computer science, sometimes in other places. And in industry, people are eager for them. Google, Facebook, Intel, Microsoft, all of them have jobs that are relevant to the research they're doing. And just hearing what you all are doing, the topics you're dealing with, frankly, are central to these big computer companies and other jobs in the private sector. And they are basic research. Now, some companies are better to work with, given your interest, than others. But I would just keep an open mind to that, because you're heading down the road of a traditional academic job. That's a strange world. And I've been very lucky, and anybody who's in academia at this point is lucky. But there's a lot of luck involved. So if you don't get your first choice in a job, big deal, because you still are coming out with really marketable skills.
That's great advice. Speaking of being digitally smart, is the LAWC program available
Oh yeah.
for use?
So the Luke program is
Luke.
Luke.
Okay.
So Luke is available, and it's liwc.net is where you can get it. Now I charge, and it's a long, complicated story, but you can lease it for a month for $10, a little bit less than $10, or you can buy it forever for I'm not even sure, $89. All the money I make from it, I donate to the psychology department at the University of Texas. So it's going to pay for students who have helped to develop it over the years. And then there's a commercial side that I've given the rights to. So this is a company called Receptivity. So I've gotten into the business world as well, using Luke to be able to work with industry in all sorts of interesting ways. So if you have a company, I'm going to send you over to Receptivity, but if it's just for research at the university, do it. And also, there's a web page at luke.net that you can actually analyze for free, one text at a time. And it's not a very efficient system, but that I didn't want it to be efficient.
I would love to know what my psychological signature is. Yes, it's very interesting. And I was just thinking while I was reading your articles, I was thinking, how could I use this in my own classroom with my own students? I think it would be very informative, especially when I was reading the article on academic success, because the students that I'm teaching are all preparing to go to college, or they're
interesting.
Right. So I was seeing that connection immediately when I was reading your article. So I was wondering.
And that's something I've wanted to do, but I just don't have the time. Can you train high school students to start using more articles and prepositions, and to force them to be more hierarchical and logical in their thinking. And I think you could, it's almost so you could have them write and then push a button and it would say, okay, so you're at this level right now.
Right. I mean, I think even not even going to the pedagogy part, but just that awareness, I think, could be very informative for the students,
It's
knowing that the
interesting.
research exists and then this is what you do.
I could put a website, you could do that. That's a great idea. Let me write that down.
I think it would be very informative. Any other?
Yeah, I have a question.
Mhm.
So I mentioned that I might stay in school for 1 year,
Mhm.
and two things I was looking into. One is HCR, human computer interaction, and the other is computational linguistic.
Right.
And I know a lot of people, they transition from computer science to computational linguistics really quickly.
Mhm.
Linguistics. But for someone from like the language background, like learning coding or data or structure for 1 year isn't competitive enough
Right.
compared to the students. So how do you think we can use that?
That's a really tough question because it's true. It's kind of like learning a new language.
Yeah.
Right.
So my own story was that I took a computer language class when I was in college, and because I'd had a summer job where they were using this program called Fortran, which is a very old language. And I realized it was interesting, so I took a course on it, and it was interesting. And then, and so I was aware of it. But, life went in different directions, so I didn't do any more of it. And every now and then, I would use it to program something simple. And then, 20 years later, was it 20 years later? Yeah, probably 20 years after I took that, we started to think that I needed a computer program to analyze what I wanted. And I was thinking, I could probably do it myself. But fortunately, I had a graduate student whose undergraduate degree had been in computer science. So she went and started looking up programs, and there's by that time a new system that was C, and so, which she didn't know herself. She knew some other things, but she learned C++. And then from there, so when she was building it, I was, looking at the code and working with her son. And then, after that, I just don't do it anymore. But I can talk to computer scientists. I know how programs work. I know what Python can do. I know what Java can do. I've done some programming in PHP and HTML, and I've written some of the online programs in HTML, and I'm terrible at it. But a lot of it is I just know it enough so I can work with a computer scientist. So my approach, and this is a tough problem in terms of training, because you can take some computational linguistics courses. The computer scientists are going to kick your butt, and you can't compete with them. You want to hire them. So let them do all the dirty work, and then you do the fun stuff, or you collaborate with them or hire them. So that's what I do. And I don't even deal with computational linguists, because computational linguists are a pain in the ass to deal with, because they have a worldview that doesn't match my worldview. And a computer scientist doesn't have a worldview. And so, but the computational linguist is somebody who came out of linguistics usually, or has really good training in linguistics. And linguists, for me, are hard to deal with, because and computational linguists have been trained. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but a computational linguist is kind of a little bit like an engineer, where they are trying to distinguish this category from that category. So let's use machine learning to identify if this is polite language or not polite language. And there is kind of this standard way of doing that. And then you come up with a model, and then for the next 10 years of your career, you are in wars with other labs trying to see who can account for the most variance. So mine, I can identify with 81% accuracy. And then the next person publishes an article with 83% accuracy. And then you come back, I can do 83.7% accuracy. And I come at it very differently, which is I'm trying to understand the difference in this case between polite and not polite language. I don't care about how much variance is accounted for. I want to have a deeper understanding. And that's where I think the kinds of way that you all are thinking and the way that I think are more valuable. You know, obviously it's completely self-serving, but that gets at the whole point of what we can bring to the table, which is if you can convince the computer scientist, I'm trying to figure out why, as opposed to don't just give me a model that can separate the two groups.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I guess this is the end of the interview. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet.
Lunch is waiting for us. Great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
You bet. Thank you.